your comments. So I don't know if you have that open.
Oh, wait. No, I don't have the comments open now. Let me just get it.
Well, I can just read the comment or part of the comment, then we can go through it. Okay, so you said you've overcome the bogus pseudo-morality of libertarianism, but not its dogmas of economics or Arbeit macht frei, slave philosophy. UBI is far more than an economic policy. It would change the entire nature of the system we live under, moving us away from capitalism and traditional socialism. This is a very rare instance where the interests of powerful factions within the oligarchy, especially the tech industry, align with the masses, albeit for very different reasons. The benefits of UBI are vast and numerous from an ethno-minoritarian or majoritarian perspective. Indeed, the list is far too exhaustive to post here. Okay, so that was your first comment. And I just want to make a few points to start off with. One is that the article that you commented on was about Yang. So it was specifically about Yang. It was not about the UBI in general. And some of your comments seem to, ignore that fact. Like I'm talking about specific things in his proposal. I've never had the pseudo-morality of libertarianism. So I've been amoral since I was 10 or something like that, so I don't believe in morality at all. I am a free market. I think free markets work, and they're the best way to organize economic activity. It doesn't mean I'm a free market fundamentalist or something like that. I don't think free markets are the be-all and end-all, or that they, are some kind of magical thing that requires no state to set up the rules and stuff. So anyway, that's my position, which I'm not sure you are aware of. So just giving the context, because it seemed to be a little bit out of context, your comment. Now,
okay,
go ahead if you want to rephrase that or respond to that.
Yeah, well, I'm aware that you were talking about Yang's UBI, but some of the points you made, I don't remember, I don't have the page up right now, but some of them were general critiques of UBI. So, for example, you said that it would make women less dependent on men economically, and that would have social repercussions. And you talked about drug use going up as well. These are basic like critiques of the UBI generally. It isn't specifically
right.
limited to Yangs.
I did critique it, but just later on, some of your comments were. Well, I mean, I can go and find them, I guess.
I did read the article. I probably read your article a couple of times. Yeah, I agree. Some of it is a bit. I can see why your interpretation was that I wasn't specifically referring to your critiques in the article. But sometimes things can get lost in translation when there's only a text there and you can't really.
Right. Well, specifically, You said this part of your critique is solely directed at Yang's method of funding rather than the UBI in itself, which is true, but it was an article directed at Yang, so that didn't make sense to me. So that made it seem like you just.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, but I see what you mean. But I think to be honest, Yang's UBI is better than no UBI at all in my view. There are lots of different ways to fund UBI. It's just some of your critique centered on the UBI as a whole, like the increase in drug use or the effect on women, and then some of it was about Yang's UBI. So I think we were both kind of skipping back and forth between the two.
Well, yeah, I do have critiques of the UBI in general. I don't think it's a good policy, but I just wanted to make that clear that I didn't put all of my, I did not put forth a specific set of arguments against the UBI in general. That I addressed some specific proposals that Yang made, and I linked to his, campaign policy documents and stuff like that. So anyway, but that's
on the libertarian stuff. You claim you've never been a libertarian moralist. You've always been amoral. Yeah, that's fine. I stand corrected on that point. Although, sometimes moralism can be a bit more subtle than just believing in like good and bad per se. So, like,
Yeah,
you
there's an element of moralism to every social interaction for sure,
yeah.
even
So
if
say a belief in the work ethic, or a belief in like the consumer economy, or just wage employment and this kind of thing. Like believing that a society with a high level of wage employment or whatever is superior to one that with a lower level. That there is a kind of a moralistic element in that, and vice versa. These things aren't completely devoid of moralism. I know in an objective sense, you would say that there is nothing superior or inferior morally, in whatever system. These are just human categories that we impose on things. But there is a more subtle form of prescriptions that we have.
well, I have prescriptions. Yeah, well, it gets sort of complicated. I mean, obviously, there is an element of where there are moral sentiments or intuitions, regardless of whether you believe in morality. But that's not where my free market beliefs come from. They come more from system theoretic thinking about the way things work. Like you could say that there's a kind of pseudo moral rejection of egalitarianism, but even that comes more from just an understanding that it simply doesn't work. So egalitarianism doesn't work in general at a very high level, but I think markets work because they provide the incentives to organize a large collective of people without them having to know very much about each other or care about each other, right? So it's almost an information theoretic argument that, well, Hayek made some of that argument in
Yeah.
the use of knowledge in society.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
That's my view, that people are selfish. They're not like acting altruistically for the good of society. They're acting selfishly within their own view of the world and within a bunch of fairly complicated bunch of deceptions and things.
But
But they
markets,
are basically
markets
selfish.
do
And
have failures, though. Markets aren't perfect. There are certain circumstances where, it would be more socially efficient not to allow a free market in certain areas. Like, although, there are a lot of examples that I could give which are just not feasible in modern society. Like, for example, women in the workforce. You could definitely argue that there would be a social benefit for not having women in the workforce, or not having so many women in the workforce, but it would be a completely anti-libertarian, anti-free market policy to say that women should be wives and homemakers and produce children rather than being lawyers, CEOs, or more menial workers, etc.
right. But I mean, there are ways of accomplishing that rather than saying women must not work.
I mean, there are ways of ameliorating the current situation we have, and I think UBI would be one way of doing it. There are other ways, of course, but I'm just saying that it would be a more in so many ways it would be socially optimal if women didn't work. But that's just not the situation we have.
I mean, I'm not so sure that I would agree with that, because we cannot have a stable society if we have high fertility. So if we want to have a stable civilization, not a collapse, not a fallback to subsistence agriculture, we're going to have to figure out a way to live with modernity, live with modern civilization. And part of that is going to be low fertility, and part of that is going to be giving people something else to do besides looking after children. So I have talked about that quite a bit in the past. You might not be aware of that, but the fundamental problem we have to solve is the reproductive tragedy of the commons. And there is a solution to that, which is you regulate reproduction. So you don't regulate reproduction by trying to get women out of the workforce. I mean, that's not really solving the problem, and it's not directly dealing with it. You have to regulate reproduction itself. So that's a very anti-libertarian thing, and that's one of my longest standing, like, heretical proposals. Anyway, but we can, I don't want to get off on a tangent into that, but, this idea that we have to do everything through economics, and indirectly, and always, like, attacking symptoms, I totally disagree with that. I think we have to deal with the actual problems, fundamental problems. And one of the fundamental problems of modernity is that it's a free ride. Anybody can reproduce to any level they choose. And this has a dysgenic effect, and it has a population explosion effect. And, I believe in dealing with that problem directly. But anyway, but let's get into the UBI points, the points you made about the UBI.
Yeah, sure.
So I have it in front of me here. Just let me scroll to it. So you said the case for UBI, the first point you made was the only class that isn't being heavily subsidized right now is the native middle. UBI changes that dramatically by directing trillions toward natives that would otherwise go to the high, that is bank bailouts, wars, tax cuts, pensions, medical, or the low, welfare, housing, education, medical. Okay, now to me, this is not really a very good argument, or it's somewhat fallacious. Obviously, you can't subsidize everybody, right? There's no way you can print money and give everybody money, but you can't actually subsidize consumption of the entire population.
You can't subsidize everyone on net. I would agree with that.
Well, yeah, I mean, all you can do is move things around, right? So you could argue that the lower classes are being subsidized. I would say that is true. You could argue that the upper classes are being subsidized. That's also true. Yeah, that there is a political problem that the upper classes sort of buy access, will buy special privileges with, campaign donations. There's this problem built into democracy. And then there's this problem of you have this underclass that really isn't terribly employable, that it's easier to just throw money at than to deal with, because, what are you going to do? Are you going to let kids die in the streets or whatever? And we don't tolerate letting people die in the streets, even if it's their own fault or the fault of their parents. So we bail out the lower classes, and we also subsidize the upper classes. So I agree with that, but obviously we cannot subsidize everyone, right? So there has to be some class that isn't being heavily subsidized. There has to be a productive class no matter what, right?
I mean, well, this really depends on a couple of things. Right. From your perspective here, it sounds like you're putting forward a kind of you're arguing from a position of sustaining the system. Well, first, like you could take an accelerationist viewpoint and say that you don't want the system to be sustained, but wholly apart from that, as you can say, we could shift resources around. So UBI would be financially feasible if certain taxes are raised and certain benefits are cut. So the way I would kind of conceive of UBI, partly at least, would be as a kind of sponge that would sort of siphon resources away from other government spending, which goes towards the high and the low, which would then go towards the middle. There was a libertarian economist, Tyler Cowen, was talking about some of the reasons why he opposes UBI, and he said, it would direct all this money towards prime age, healthy, middle class people, and away from the poor and this kind of stuff. So from that perspective, I think UBI would be an excellent policy, because there are all of the the financial bailouts, these wars in the Middle East. Obviously the wealthy will, I don't know, if we're talking about the top 10% of earners, then they pay most of the income tax. But if we talk about like the MAGA corporations, Walmart, they've got all their ways of avoiding taxes, so they don't really pay much at all. I think
corporate taxes don't really matter that much, because there's a double taxation there, right? They tax corporations, then they tax the profits on corporations when they're paid as income, like dividends and stuff like that. So it's there are a lot of like accounting tricks and things, but so the fact that there are a lot of problems with the existing tax system, a lot of loopholes and stuff like that, isn't really an argument for expanding it and expanding the scope of government spending. Because unless you have a way of getting rid of all the loopholes, and just saying, well, let the government hand out checks, and we'll just assume the government won't put loopholes in the checks or, rig the checks in favor of one class versus another. I mean, why wouldn't they when they already do that with everything else, right? Like, who's to say that the UBI wouldn't say, oh, well, we're going to give women extra money because they're women, or black people are going to get extra money as reparations.
That would no longer be a UBI then. I mean, they may have other programs in addition to the UBI, like some libertarians like Charles Murray conceive of the UBI that would replace all other programs, and then someone like Yang conceives of UBI which would replace some programs but would leave others in place. The devil's kind of in the details there. But I don't really have a problem in theory with a government that is going to spend a lot of money in tax. I mean, it already does, and I don't think we're getting the toothpaste back in the tube on this point. So we may as well just work for the middle better.
No, but my point is that you can't really use that as an argument. Like, you can't say, well, right now, the people at the high end get all this, this extra stuff, and they get all these benefits and stuff. And the UBI would change that when the UBI is just as like open to abuse as that other system. So you can't have a utopian conception of your thing while you have a more realistic conception of the alternative, right? You have to be realistic about both sides, or you're cherry picking. So
how do you mean? How is it not real? I would expect. I would say it was utopian if I just said, oh, the UBI is going to come in and replace all the other policies. No, it's likely that there are going to be other welfare policies as well as the UBI in existence, and it will increase government spending. I don't deny it.
How would it replace the corruption? How would it eliminate corruption?
Oh, it's not going to eliminate corruption. Nothing's going to eliminate corruption.
Right. So no matter what, there's going to still be the corruption, right? Or at least Absolutely. It doesn't address the corruption. And it doesn't generate any new wealth. And there's a pretty good argument that it would reduce overall production, economic production.
I think it would, yeah.
So there's going to be a smaller pie, which will still be unfairly distributed or corruptly distributed. So,
but UBI though would at least provide, it provides like a base level of wealth. Essentially, it provides like a living amount of wealth for the whole population, essentially.
Well, so, I'm not sure that you could even claim that's the case, because you'd have to assume a priori that some kind of price stability, right? You'd have to basically assume that if we give everybody the UBI, like we give everybody $1,000 a month or whatever it is, that the prices of things won't adjust to the point where that's no longer sufficient to maintain your a basic lifestyle.
Well, yeah, there wouldn't be very high levels of inflation, yeah, but I don't think there would be, because there are. I mean, I've seen Scott Sumner. He's a libertarian economist. He doesn't believe there'd be significant inflation as a result of this policy. Brian Kaplan is very anti-UBI, but he doesn't make the inflation argument. And then there are economists on the other end of the spectrum who are post-Keynesians. I don't think it would. I think this is something that a lot of libertarians do talk about, like there's going to be hyperinflation, but provided we're not like printing enormous amounts of money to give everyone UBI, provided the budget, it's being sent, there is tax rises in some places, welfare spending cuts in others to fund it.
I don't think you're changing patterns of consumption, no matter what, you're going to be changing the price structure. You're changing supply and demand, right? So if this is going to have any effect whatsoever, like let's say it allows the middle class, it gives the middle class more spending power relative to the top 10% or something like that, then that spending power is going to go toward different things. You're going to change the demand for those things. You're also going to change the supply. of anything that's labor intensive, making everything labor intensive more expensive. So, you can't just assume that this will, have, like, you can't hold the current economy constant and then imagine everybody has $1,000 more, right? And I know you're not making that kind of claim, but still you have to take into account that, well, the economy itself is going to change, right? And you cannot just assume that, well, if I give everybody in the middle class this extra money, that it's going to be sufficient to afford the things that they currently we currently consider necessary for a basic standard of living, right? For example, it could increase rents, because
to some degree, yeah.
right. I mean, it could lower house prices, so it could reduce the cost of buying a house, but it could increase rents because you now have more people with more cash competing for rents in the cities, right?
Yeah, but this is not really a problem as far as I'm concerned. If rent especially rises in the cities, this is going to reduce fertility rate of urban people, and it's also going to encourage people who are less inclined towards urban living to move to low-class rural areas. It's also going to encourage people, in order to circumvent these rent prices, in order to form kind of communes and families, rather than living as isolated singles and bearing all the costs, essentially.
Well, maybe it'll have these effects that you consider positive, but you have to consider that there could be negative effects as well. And the prediction of all the different effects is somewhat complicated. The one thing you can't do is just assume the economy as it is will stay the same, but the people that you want to have more spending power will have more spending power in an unchanged economy. So you can't make that assumption. That is a fallacy. You could.
I don't.
I know, but a lot of people do, right? And you got to be.
Calling it a fallacy is going too far, because I mean, it's definitely going to boost their spending. It may not boost it at quite as much as I'd like it to, but I'd say predictions of runaway inflation of goods prices as well. I don't think that's based on any empirical evidence.
Well, I don't know that any of this is going to be based on empirical evidence because we haven't done it, right? Like,
well, there have been trials of UBI, but they haven't. I don't think they've been widespread enough. I don't think they've been on a national level, so we can't know exactly what would happen.
Right. Well, what we have tried a lot in the past is various forms of communism, right? Or large scale,
Well, this isn't communism.
It's not, but it is certainly closer to communism than it is closer to the state owning the means of production, and certainly it's closer to communism than what we have now, in the sense that people are now dependent on the government, and in a sense, you still have private enterprise organizing things, but private enterprise has much less power, essentially. You've taken away a lot of power from private enterprise when you give everybody a check, because
you do.
Right. And so you might think that's a good thing, but you have to accept that now you've taken the power away from private enterprise and given it to the government, right? And you've given the government the power to set all the...
I don't see a huge distinction between the two. I think the private enterprise system and the government are kind of one and the same these days. Any big corporation and the government, there isn't really much distinction to draw.
Well, there is somewhat of a distinction. I mean, if there were no distinction, then there would be no way to ever get this thing done anyway, right? So maybe the corruption problem is a prior problem you have to solve before you could ever get the UBI. Because if the UBI screws over the big corporations, then according to your theory or political theory, this would never happen.
Well, it'll affect different corporations differently. So I think
you seem to believe
it has a lot of support among the kind of Silicon Valley tech corporations. It's going to benefit some corporations massively, which is why a lot of these oligarchs are supporting it.
Yeah, some of these oligarchs are supporting it. So the claim that it's that the government and private enterprise are the same is not really true.
Well, they have a lot of the same. From my perspective, they all support feminism, they all support LGBTQ, they all support massive immigration. So from that perspective, they are one and the same.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that that's because that stuff is a sort of religious belief system that is used. It's a cloak that people use to they wrap themselves in that cloak to claim virtue. And
It is
and
partly that, but it's also that it's also very good for the bottom line. It also there's an element of divide and conquer there where they can like immigration. They provide themselves with cheap labor, and they also divide and conquer the population, make it and just increase their power. Feminism similar, LGBT is similar. Then there's the virtue signaling aspect of all of it.
I don't think it's as organized or deliberate as that. I think it's more of more something that is happening than something that is the result of agency.
Well, you don't
But
think big corporations are specifically lobbying for cheap labor in order to?
well, specific corporations are specifically lobbying for cheap labor, right? But I mean, to some extent, they are also uh, they don't really see the big picture themselves. So like well, it's a complicated thing. They are engaged in a competition with other corporations. So the corporation that gets the specific government policies that benefit it specifically relative to other corporations will do better than those other corporations. But they're not all colluding toward one big policy. The mass immigration thing is a kind of generic subsidy for the upper class, for sure, right?
Excuse me.
And
Just give me a second.
oh, okay.
Just literally 30 seconds. Hello.
Yep, I'm here.
Okay, let's continue. We're talking about
Well,
corporation.
I
Yeah.
was, I mean, we were talking about corruption, the problem of corruption, and look, mass immigration is something that is a separate issue, I think, and lumping it in here doesn't really make sense.
Well,
Stopping mass immigration.
it is linked with the UBI issue in certain ways because we can get into that later. But
Well,
it
yeah,
would.
let's get into
Yeah.
that later, but I'll just want to say first that uh, reducing immigration would definitely benefit that native middle that you're talking about, and
Hmm.
that's the fundamental thing. And UBI, would it or wouldn't it? I think it's pretty iffy because it's going to reduce the amount of production, it's going to shift things around, it's going to give more government power. So we can talk about all the details of that, but there's a much simpler thing which is kind of a no-brainer, which is cut mass immigration. So why even worry about this policy when there's
Well,
another?
cutting mass immigration. I don't think there is any elite constituency in favor of cutting mass immigration, unfortunately, because there is the elite incentives for mass immigration go beyond economics. There's also the high-low versus the middle. There's also divide and conquer, increasing surveillance over the population. So I don't think there's any billionaire or any tech firm or any corporation that's calling for cutting immigration. It would also be bad for their image as well.
There
And
might at
UBI,
some point.
you sorry.
I mean, there might start to be some people who are making that case. But yeah, we have a
Well, if
problem, which is that
why,
the elites are.
why would a big corporation benefit from cutting immigration? Because all these people have the money to live in areas that are unaffected by immigration, but in terms of their power and wealth, they benefit
Well,
enormously from it.
if you want to live in a society that's functional and mass immigration is going to destroy it, you might say, you know what, actually, I want this country to exist in the future. I don't want collapse. You know,
Yeah, but look at Brazil. The rich do very, very well in Brazil. In any of these third world countries, you can find areas that are very, very nice, very, very wealthy. It's just the lower and middle classes who have to live in the crap.
well, it's very expensive, and it isn't that great in Brazil because if you go out, you can't go for a walk, right? So like, yeah, if you're super, super, super rich, then you have the golf courses and you have all the places where private beaches and stuff. But there is a fairly large constituency of people. I think even elites might say, look, I don't want civilization to collapse. I don't want this whole thing to come crashing down. So, if they have a slightly longer term perspective, they might start thinking, oh, maybe this isn't such a great idea.
It's like they do things that are incomprehensible though from that perspective. Like they import loads and loads of Muslims. Like if they were just importing people for efficiency reasons or whatever, they could import people from China or something like that. But they deliberately import a lot of the most
Right.
violent terroristic populations possible, the most dependent populations possible. And
Right. It doesn't
this
make
seems
sense.
calculated to cause serious problems.
Right,
Although I
right.
don't
So,
necessarily think those civilizational I don't think necessarily we're going to have a jihadist uprising in Europe. I think it's probably more likely that they will be kind of absorbed into the kind of liberal mass over time.
well, in a way, but what you're seeing right now, even like with this coronavirus thing, is a sort of a switching of places where the East just became the first world and the West just became the second world. You know, these things matter. Like these policies matter. Uh, and the elites, but it's complicated. Some of the elites will say, well, I can just move to China or something like that. But they might say, I want to stay in this country. I want to have a future. If they were smart enough to figure this out. So like there are two theories. One is the very smart elites who are carrying out some kind of conspiracy. The other theory is they're not that smart and they're just kind of religious and going along with some kind of set of ideas that
Yeah.
they're not really thinking about very much either.
In
Okay,
the case
anyway.
of America as well, I think a lot of their really powerful elites probably don't feel native to the country at all.
Well,
So they,
there's an element of that, yeah, but again, that's a very simple, like people want to believe these simple conspiracy theory type arguments, but that doesn't really explain it either.
Well, I'm sure it's more complicated than that, but if you have a very large percentage of your elites who are essentially dual citizens and they feel like they can just hop away from the country at the first sign of trouble, then that is going to create a problem.
True, it's a problem, but they can't just hop away to somewhere else, and the other place is just as dangerous. So it doesn't really make sense. Yeah, I don't. Again, this is a separate issue, but I don't see some great conspiratorial agency behind this all. I see a kind of stupidity, short-term thinking, and historical processes. Anyway, but if you believe in all this agency, then I don't think.
Well, I would think elites they're in that position, generally speaking. The super elites are in there because they are intelligent, because they are kind of unified networking. They are very, these are not like idiots who can't make sense of their own positions. These people understand their own interests better than we understand their interests, I think.
Well, they're not idiots. They're 120 IQ extroverts. But do any of them understand?
What the Bloombergs and the really powerful oligarchs?
There might be a few of those guys who are smart enough to understand what's going on. I don't think they're that smart. Okay. But I don't know. That's a separate issue. If we get into that, we'll probably never get to the rest of the UBI stuff. So let's set that aside. So the second point, it took a long time to go through the first one, but the second point was elimination of much of the parasitic, inefficient, self-serving, pro-system welfare bureaucracy. This might. I don't know how that's going to work, really. Are they just going to fire them all? I'd be pretty skeptical of that.
The UBI is a lot more streamlined. It's a lot more simple just to mail out a check to people than to have all of these means testing administrators who are going to determine, are you too young? Are you the right age? What's your family status, your employment history, disabilities, otherwise? It's just a lot more simple. So if you could eliminate, say, 30 or 40% of the current welfare programs, because I don't think they're going to eliminate all of them, and just replaced it with mailing checks, then that would eliminate quite a bit of the bureaucracy. I don't think that's a particularly important or strong point, because we're not going to eliminate the whole thing. So.
Yeah, in theory you could do that. In practice, it's dubious that there would be anybody laid off, and I don't think Yang proposed really getting rid of it. He proposed you have a choice, and of course everybody on welfare now would choose welfare. Well, almost everybody, maybe not everybody.
Yeah, if they have like multiple children and they're in a government subsidized house or whatever, then they would, yeah.
You say welfare babies would become financial burdens rather than assets, reducing the birth rates of single women in the underclass. Well, I don't think that women are having babies as a deliberate way of making money. I mean, there might be a few, but I think generally speaking,
I think there are. In the underclass, I think that's quite common.
Well, I think it's a way of life. And so, like, I don't think they plan it out. Like, okay, I'm going to have another kid, so my welfare check goes up. It's more that they just don't care.
No,
Now,
I do think there is I do think there is rational decision making there. I think that if they have 3, 4 children and they can claim benefits and all of them, they get moved into a house and this kind of thing. They don't have to work. I think it becomes a culture in that community where,
right.
It's
more of a
something that they
culture.
do
Yeah.
and then they follow in. But if there was if the child benefits got cut off and if that wasn't, and the public housing, and that wasn't a viable way, then fewer people would do it and it would just become less of a cultural thing.
Yeah, well, so there is this kind of culture of welfare dependency, and part of that is women are incentivized not to partner up with men because, or at least with men who have jobs, because the men who have jobs then would result in the welfare getting taken away and all this stuff. So there are a lot of perverse incentives in the current system. Now, however, I don't think this statement is really true, or it would work like that, because if you allow babies to become financial burdens, then the babies are going to die or they're going to suffer. And people will say,
Yep.
we can't have babies suffering. And that's the whole that's the whole moral justification for welfare in the first place, right? You can't let these little babies suffer, right?
Well, they would have the money. They have the money to take care of the babies. It's just there are going to be some people in the underclass who are going to abuse their children, not take care of them. I mean, that already happens to a large degree. There's a huge amount of abortion as well. That's just
but
the
if
way
a
it
woman
is.
has 6 kids and she gets $1,000 a month, those kids are in trouble, right? Well, they certainly will have no place to sleep. They'll be sleeping on the floor in a living room, and they'll barely be eating enough food. And I think the pressure to step in and rescue the poor, even from their own decisions or from the decisions of their parents.
They can already take children away if you're a negligent, irresponsible parent. Like that's not anything new.
Sure, but then you have the babies are a financial burden to society, so it does not really address the problem. I mean, I don't think we can assume that women are going to make these choices sort of rationally and economically, especially in an early period of this.
In an early period, I mean, there would probably be a bit of adjustment there. It would depend partly how it was implemented. I mean, if you could like Charles Murray had this idea where child support would be taken out of the UBI of men who knocked these women up, and these women would have the responsibility of taking care of the children, this kind of thing. It would depend partly on the implementation. But
I think if
we were throwing benefits at these women, then they would have fewer children. But
anyway, I would say you need to attack this problem at the root. I don't think UBI is really going to make a difference. It's not really addressing the fundamental issue, which is that people can get a free ride, reproductive free ride, at the expense of society. And if you want to stop that without letting children die, you have to prevent them from having children. You have to say, look, you're on welfare, you're on birth control. That's it.
That's an idea sterilizing the underclass, no matter how beneficial that could be in theory from a eugenic point of view. That's not on the cards, and I don't know if I'd even want it to be on the cards, because it would be used in political ways. So it would be used to sterilize political dissidents and this kind of thing. I think
it's just as, I mean, if that's open to abuse, then the UBI is open to abuse, right? I mean, again, you can't cherry pick, right? You can't say, I don't want to give the government this power, but I want to give it this. I want to make everybody dependent of the government, so the government takes away your check, you're fucked. But I don't want to give the government this other power, this much more limited.
Everything's open to abuse. I mean, the government right now, people get fired for hate speech, hate crime. People can get fired for that, no problem. That's not a particular criticism of UBI. That's, people can be killed.
But they can find another job. Whereas with UBI, if the government takes away your check for being a bad boy or something, or your social credit score is bad, so you don't get the little bonus they tack on for all the good people who upload cupcake videos instead of race realism videos, I mean, you can't just assume that one form of government power won't be abused, and the other thing you'll say, well, I'll never accept that because that would be abused. You have to accept the risk in both cases, right?
It can all, of course, it can all be, like, the government is going to potentially use its power in order to crack down on people it doesn't like. That's what it does now, and it's what it's to do then.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I don't know whether they're going to be disenfranchising people because they haven't done it with universal healthcare in Europe, right? Universal healthcare. In theory, they could just say to people with views they don't like, "Oh, you can't have free public healthcare," but they've never done that. And part of the reason they don't do that is because they would undermine the principle of universality, and if they did that, then it could be used as a pretext to undermine all welfare measures as a whole. So we haven't seen that in Europe with universal programs. We haven't seen, well, they do take away people's children, don't they? Like,
Yeah.
They do that as well. They do that right now.
Right. They might take away your children for being a Nazi or something. So I think, yeah, the problem of government, of tyranny is not solved by any government program. I mean, limiting the power of government is nice, but again, I'm not a libertarian, and I think you need government power, you need state power to solve certain problems. And so I think, welfare requires birth control is a pretty reasonable limitation. But yeah, I don't think UBI is really, my counter argument to this point is that, yeah, I don't think this is based on some kind of rational economic decision making. And even if it were, there are going to be people who will just say, who cares? We'll just have as many kids as we want, whatever, for religious reasons or just because we don't.
Oh, well,
don't
if
care.
they're doing it for religious reasons, it depends who's having the children. If it helps certain people have more children, I might be very favorable towards that.
Yeah, but no matter what, you get a tragedy of the commons. It doesn't matter. I mean, it matters who's having them in the sense that if they're supporting them themselves, then it's not a burden on society. But if you have people who are, let's say they're super religious, they never commit any crimes, and you find them to be aesthetically pleasing, like let's say they're Amish or whatever, but they have 8 kids and the kids go on welfare, well, it's still a tragedy of the commons, and they're dragging down, that's a burden on society. So I think
sure. I don't take the view that I don't really care about society.
I'm saying that taking away food out of babies. Okay, let me just make the point really quick. Taking food out of babies' mouths, which is what this might do. You're saying this would, we take away the money from women who have kids. I think that would be harder for most people to accept than people on welfare shouldn't have babies. I think that's something more people would be willing to accept. You could debate that, but and I would prefer to attack the problem at the root and say, look, you have to meet these criteria to have a child, rather than, well, we're going to try to rig some economic incentives to make you, have fewer or more children or whatever.
Aside from I think universal basic income would be desirable by ideal state or in the situation we have now, but the idea of birth control for welfare, that's just not on the agenda, So it's fine to say that in theory it'd be good to have that policy.
But hold on. Getting rid of welfare for babies is not on the agenda either. UBI might be on the agenda, but only if it has no negative effects, right? That's the way these things are pitched, right? Only if nobody starves.
No, like every policy has got positive and negative effects, at least on certain people. That's going to happen.
The way that the UBI is being pitched by people like Yang is that, well, this will not affect anybody on welfare. Nobody will lose a penny. No baby will lose their food.
He's a politician. He's gonna say what he's got to say to pass his policies.
Oh, but he's not going to take welfare away. I mean, I don't know why you would think that. I mean, yeah, Yang's not going to be president anyway, but I don't know.
No, that's not going to happen.
What's not going to happen?
Oh, Yang's not going to be president.
Right. So I mean, again, you're sort of cherry picking. You're like, well, this is not politically practical. UBI is not politically practical either.
Well, no. Well,
we're speaking hypothetically, right?
That depends on the country. I'm not just thinking about America here. I think this is an idea that is going to be implemented in the future. A lot of countries are looking into it, and I think it is kind of riding a kind of a wave of history, and that sounds a bit grandiose, but it has a lot of things.
Well, it sounds like what communists were saying in the early 1900s, right?
They were right. No, the communists were right. It was riding. It didn't ultimately succeed, but it did for a long time. It did ride a wave of history, and it did conquer almost half of the countries in the world.
Yeah, and it didn't work. I mean, it
Yeah,
mimetically worked. It didn't economically work.
but you can say it got swept aside, but a lot of good like not saying that communism is per se a good idea, but a lot of good things. If you're a reactionary, then say ethnically homogeneous. There's a lot to be said for ethnically homogeneous nations. But in the West, at least, they're kind of few in number. Mainly in Eastern Europe, Sweden, like Sweden's transition from a Swedish society to a multicultural society with a lot of Africans and Arabs. I don't think that was a good thing, but it was certainly the way for the future, right? Multiculturalism was the way for the future.
Yeah, but that doesn't, I mean, I'm not in favor of things because they're popular, riding a wave of popularity or something like that.
No, neither am I. But
Uh,
I'm just saying that I think it will be implemented in some countries
okay.
because there are structural reasons to think it will be.
Yeah, I mean, the most interesting argument for it would be that we're moving into a post-work future or something like that, where we have to restructure the way that people receive the right to consume. That organizing the right to consume through labor, like getting the right to consume by virtue of selling your labor, might have to be phased out. I think that's an interesting thing to ponder. And the coronavirus epidemic is an example where, because people are because they mostly need to work to get the right to consume, and suddenly they have to be put out of work. This is a historical event that demonstrates a limitation of relying on the market and labor as, the means of getting your right to exist. But so I think that is the interesting argument,
Well,
which
that's an interesting thing, yeah. But there are many things I find, like for example, like people talk about the 40-hour work week, but it's not really 40 hours because if you count preparing to go to work, getting to work, being
mhm.
at work, returning from work, tying up the loose ends after work, recovering from work, including winding down, getting to bed over. That's not even counting overtime and things like that, maybe extra housework, shopping. We're talking more like 60 extra hours a week, not 40, 60 hours. And that's not just time, it's also energy. So there's all that time and energy that's being put into work for probably a politically correct organization, be it whether it's a corporation or a bureaucracy. And I think work is used to kind of enslave us to a large degree. This isn't just a view on the far left. This is also a view on the far right. Friedrich Nietzsche took this view. He said that behind the glorification of work and the tireless talk of the blessings of work, I find the same thought as behind the praise of impersonal activity for the public benefit, the fear of everything individual. At bottom, one now feels when confronted with work, and what is invariably meant is relentless industry from early till late, that such work is the best police, that it keeps everybody in harness and powerfully obstructs the development of reason, of covetousness, of the desire for independence. For it uses up a tremendous amount of nervous energy and takes it away from reflection, brooding, dreaming, worry, love, and hatred. It always sets a small goal before one's eyes and permits easy and regular satisfactions. In that way, a society in which the members continually work hard will have more security, and security is now adored as the supreme goddess.
I mean,
So all
Nietzsche.
that energy could be used for other endeavors, be they
Yeah,
political or health or non-political, etc.
yeah. I mean, look, it's a sort of utopian idea. Like, so I think it's an interesting thing to think about, but I don't think we're anywhere near a post-work economy or world. Like, we're way far away from that. We still need to labor to produce the goods and services that we need to consume to live. And the other thing is we have a big, we don't have any alternative to organizing our lives around work as of yet. And you're not really proposing one. You still expect people to go to work, right? You're just saying, well, this would give them more freedom.
Well,
But
I would expect that. Well, I'm not saying that this is going to lead to a post-work society. I'm not making a Bob
no,
Black
I know.
argument, but I am saying that fewer people would work. And to be honest, in the past, a lot of people didn't. Like a lot of people weren't part of the labor market. So half the population in women weren't part part of the labor market. Then you've got the young who aren't part of the labor market. Then you've got the very old who aren't part of the labor market, and the sick and the disabled. So for large parts of time, in capitalist economies, more than half the population hasn't been in employment.
Mm-hmm.
So that's nothing new, really.
Right. Well, we're also going to end up with that because of the aging population. So no matter what, we're going to have a large part of the population out of work, and that is something that needs to be dealt with, and we need to, understand the consequences of that. Of course, that doesn't argue for a specific solution, and I don't think you can simply assume that even with the UBI, that this would actually make people work less, because people right now could work less, right? You don't have to work 40 hours a week if you don't want to. You could work less for less production, to consume less. You could work less and consume less. You could make that choice. Most people don't make it, and they don't make it because they want to consume, either for status reasons or because they need those things, or they perceive a need for those things. So with the UBI, you're going to have a smaller GDP. You're going to have less on average per person. I don't see any reason why people would necessarily. I mean, I do think some people would work less. You're reducing the incentive to work.
I certainly think people would work less. That's one of the points where on the libertarian arguments, UBI I do agree with. I think it's called the income effect. When people have more money, then they have a lower tendency to work. I mean, people don't really enjoy work. They do work for
more money. Again, you can't.
More money, they'll work less.
You cannot assume things are the same. They're not going to have more spending power when you have the UBI.
I think they would have more spending power.
If fewer people are working, then there's going to be less production, and so the total amount of consumption is going to be less.
Yes, there would be, yeah.
So you're going to have less spending power than before, on
somewhat
average.
Somewhat less.
All you're doing is shuffling resources around. While if you do disincentivize people from working, you're reducing the overall amount of production.
But I'm not in favor of people just producing and consuming. This isn't. That's
fine. I'm just saying, let's be realistic here. You're going to have people consuming. If they're not going to have more spending power just because you give them a check. If I just gave you a check and didn't give anybody else a check, you would have more spending power. But if you give everybody a check, you do not increase spending power.
You don't. Well, it depends. If you give everyone a check, but you're taxing some more to pay for,
you're changing the distribution.
Yes, you're changing the distribution. Yeah.
But overall, your claim is you're going to reduce work. If you're going to reduce work, you're going to reduce production. So that's you're going to reduce total consumption.
Yes, that is correct. And that's part of the advantage of the policy as I see it. Yeah, you're going to reduce production and consumption.
Right. So, but just to be clear, people are not going to have more spending power. They're going to have less. It might be distributed a different way.
Yes. Yeah, that's the important point. It's going to be distributed.
What exactly is being produced that you want that could be distributed to the people in the middle that they're not currently consuming?
Partly time and energy. And freedom.
But it's not like because they could already have more time and energy by doing less work. They're not choosing to do that.
Just pure. Well, yeah, they could, but I think this would give them an extra incentive if they knew that their base level of needs was just going to be taken care of. Then they will work less. But I'm not just talking about the majority.
Well, you assume their base level of needs is going to be taken care of by just assuming that the overall, because you're reducing the total production. And you're changing you're changing who has what money. You're changing the distribution of money, and you're reducing the overall amount of production. You just assume that this check would be sufficient, even though people are working less, to give them what they want.
If it wasn't sufficient, then it would have to be adjusted, wouldn't it?
Well, but then you just get this runaway inflation where you just keep increasing it, and then you have the same effect where it's less of an incentive, and so fewer people work, and also the price of goods and services goes up, and so you increase it again, and eventually you have $1 trillion Reichsmarks, and it's nothing. Right?
I think this is doomsaying. I think this is libertarian doomsaying that the UBI
hyperinflation is a real thing, and it's happened every time governments have printed large amounts of money to finance government spending that went directly into the economy, as opposed to what we've been doing, bailing out corporations and stuff. which has mostly caused inflation in asset prices, stocks and houses and things like that, which I totally disagree with.
Yeah, well, completely
But my
correct.
point, but you can't just assume that, oh, I can just print up money and it won't make any difference in
No, I'm not
prices.
saying, I'm saying we have to tax more in some places, cut spending in other places in order to
Right.
fund it.
So, but taxing might shuffle around money. But the thing is, the real economy, like it might be that the top 10% make, I don't know, whatever percent of the income, 50% of the income. They might have 80% of the paper wealth. But the actual consumption of the economy is not, there's not that much of it that goes to the top 10% or the
No,
top 1%.
they own the hard assets, though. That's
They own
what's
the
really,
paper assets.
and the land and the capital.
Sure, but they're not actually they're not consuming 50% of the food or 50% of the water, 50% of the electricity, living in 50% of the houses, using up 50% of the computers, reading 50% of the books, whatever. So the actual real consumption of the economy is mostly distributed to the middle class, and the financial system is this kind of weird, distorted thing that is mostly an illusion. I mean, it does not reflect the distribution of real wealth. Like, look, people live in houses, and the bank supposedly owns the house, which means some rich person who owns the bank shares owns the house in theory, but the person living in it is still living in it, right?
Yeah, they're living in it, but they're going to have to pay 3 times the amount of the value of the house back to the bank.
Right, right. They're going to have to send digits for the in return for the house,
Yeah,
but they're
money
still using the
money is
house.
just being created out of thin air, basically, by the bank.
Well, my point is though that the whole system, as weird and screwed up and corrupt as it is, and it has a lot of problems. My point is that real consumption is not that disproportionately distributed. The real goods and services that people consume do go mostly to the middle. They're
Yeah, but I want people to be able to, and this isn't just about the majority. I'm also talking from a minoritarian perspective. I'm also talking about like small groups of individuals. I want them to be able to survive without being dependent on the economic, without like the employment system essentially. I want them taken out of that. I want social activities to increase. I want political activities to increase, and I don't want them to have to worry about selling 60 hours a week to an employer.
So you want them to be subsidized by the working people.
Yes.
Okay, but why would the working people want to subsidize your minoritarian society?
Well, I think that after you start giving people their $1,000 a month or whatever, they're going to get addicted to that. They're going to want to keep it. So, you can say it's irrational or whatever, but that's what's going to happen.
Yeah, but that doesn't really answer the question.
Of what
I
now?
mean, sorry, what?
What doesn't it answer?
Well, the question of why would the working people work so that your minoritarian society, which this seems to be one of your main concerns, is that you want some little group that lives off of the state. In other words, lives off the productive labor of other people. I mean, why would the other people be willing to do that and
Well,
tolerate your group? Like, let's say your group lives in their little rural community and has 8 kids each and,
yeah.
and lives in a very peaceful. Why wouldn't they at some point say, well, fuck these people?
Well, they tolerate a lot of movement, don't they? They tolerate
Wait,
the system.
hold on, you're breaking up. You just broke up, so just repeat that.
Well, they tolerate a hell of a lot at the moment, don't they? They tolerate you can list all the things that they do tolerate, so I don't think it's going to change really. I think if you give people universal basic income, people use it as they please, and most people will continue to work, and that'll be it.
Well, eventually it breaks down. Eventually, you build that big welfare dependent population, right? Because you're basically giving out, free sugar, water, whatever. You're giving out free energy, and so people will, a system will emerge that exploits it. Like in Israel, the ultra-Orthodox Jews sort of, emerged to exploit their system, and now that's becoming a problem, and now there's big political conflict over that. Like what you're setting up is if you set up a system that somebody can exploit, you can't assume that the people who will exploit it will just be the ones you like,
No,
right?
all different groups are gonna use these strategies, and that's fine.
And so if it's exploitable, then eventually it will come crashing down because it will be exploited to the point where it can no longer sustain itself. It's not producing enough to deal with all the parasitic groups within it and also sustain its existing structure, and it will collapse.
Well, maybe in the long term, but we can't say what we can't know what will happen in the long term.
Well, I think we can predict things like,
Well,
if you throw up something, it will fall down, and if you have an unsustainable system, it will eventually collapse. I mean, we can predict the long term. You can't just say, oh, I can't predict the long term when I don't want to
if a
predict.
group of people want to move out to the hinterlands with their UBI and form their communities and things like that, then yeah.
Yeah, but
So
example is like the Amish, okay? And so you can do the calculations on the Amish. If the Amish maintain their way of life, in 300 years, there are 8 billion Amish. So I can say that's not gonna happen.
yeah,
You
that
know?
won't happen.
Right, because at some point people are going to say, sorry, Amish, you can't keep doing this. At some point it leads to war. At some point it leads to something, right? It's not going to just go on forever. When you have a little group that's doing it, you might be able to carry it on for a while, but then it always creates a reaction. And people say, well, we're not going to keep working so these guys can, live on welfare. I'm not saying the Amish live on welfare. I'm just saying the Amish way of life, high reproduction, is is not a long-term solution, right? Yeah, it can go on for a while until.
With affirmative action, right? The majority of the population is white, yet white people have given quotas to minority groups that prioritize them and their success and their socioeconomic status over their own, and they just accept it. And
Right, but that's not sustainable, right? I
okay,
mean,
it's not sustainable, but it's been going on a hell of a long time and doesn't look like it'll be taken away anytime soon because white people will be a minority and then they'll vote for even more affirmative action than they have now.
oh yeah, yeah. So that's a good reason why you don't, adopt unsustainable policies because they lead to disaster, and that's what's
Oh,
happening.
disaster for who though? I mean, look, if you want to preserve the system in some form, or if you want to preserve white people, then yeah, affirmative action is a bad policy. But if you want to grind down the birth rates and the family formation of white people, it's a fantastic policy.
Sure, right. But so are you saying UBI is a great policy because it will eventually destroy the countries that adopt it?
No, that's not what I'm saying. Although you can take an accelerationist position. Like you could say, for example, Western civilization is fucked, it's all over, and therefore whatever hastens its decline is a good thing. That's not the point I'm making with UBI. But even if that were the case, well, we're being replaced with our own country, and the family's being completely destroyed, and 90% of young boys are hooked on pornography now from an early age. So it's like, what is there left to preserve? You know what I mean? You could definitely take that attitude. Just give me the money.
Well, give you the money, which will not be worth anything because everybody else gets it. I mean, I don't. Yeah, it just doesn't make sense to me.
Worth
Like, so you
anything.
want to help if you wanted to help. Hold
Bullshit.
on.
You can't say it won't be
No,
worth anything because everybody else gets it. That's
no,
nuts.
that is basically how it works. I mean, you cannot increase wealth by just giving people money. Money is not wealth.
Change the
Okay.
distribution. You can
Yeah,
change
well,
the.
what you're claiming that somehow you would get more of it by changing the distribution, but yet you're not really changing the distribution of it, or well, like what are you going to what are you going to get that is somebody else is consuming right now? You're claiming this would somehow give you a larger share of production, but you're also saying that it would reduce production, and the upper classes don't consume an enormous amount of production. They just have a lot of paper wealth. So what exactly are you going to get out of this?
But how much of the actual economy is actually is necessary? A huge amount, like 100 plus years ago, we were a very heavily agricultural economy. Actually, probably more than 100 years ago, but most people were involved in agriculture,
Right.
and over time, now agriculture is what, like 2% of the economy.
Well,
So
it's 2%. I don't think it's 2% of the economy, but it's
it's a
2% of the
tiny
workforce.
percentage. It's a tiny percentage. So it's gone from,
Food
and that's
production
replaced
is
by a huge amount of rubbish, essentially, a huge amount of stuff that is not really necessary. a lot of bread and circuses.
Yeah, but you're talking about uh, financial measures. You have to always remember money is an illusion. Okay. When actually food production is a really big part of the real economy. And a lot of the things that are produced are food or food related. A significant amount of people's budgets is food related. If you have a family, I have, 5 kids. I've got a teenage son who eats like, 4 eggs a day or something. Like it's not a trivial part of my family's expenses. Uh, so you might say that in financial terms it's a small part, but again, there's all these weird illusions, like money being created, going to people as debt, which then flows back and gets destroyed when they pay it off. And it's, you know, when you look at what real, I mean, agriculture is very efficient. It doesn't consume a lot of energy, but it's a very large percentage of what people the food is a large percentage of what people consume.
Yeah, but they also throw away a huge. I mean, you could probably feed the country, with the amount that Americans throw away every year. It's like there's
Well,
huge.
the efficiency comes at a cost. I mean, I don't know. I mean, people used to throw the slop to the pigs, and they were also really hungry, so they wouldn't leave anything on the plate. But that's not really an indictment of the system, right? It just means the system is so productive, so efficient that we can throw away food. We have more than we need. We have all these obese people and all that stuff.
Mm.
So I don't believe in infinite economic growth. I would not be averse to reducing the overall size of the economy if that's a deliberate choice. I don't think anybody is proposing, hey, let's have the UBI because it will reduce the size of the economy.
There are a lot of people who are proposing that. There are so many different groups and individuals who promote UBI for so many different reasons. There are ecologists who will say the UBI is good because it will reduce production and consumption overall and gradually move us away from this work-based economy.
Yeah, well, I don't know. I mean, I don't know. Maybe there are people making those arguments.
There are.
Anyway, okay, so I this has taken a lot longer than I expected, so I don't want to go through every one of these point by point. I just want to address a couple specific ones here that struck me as very strange. Like the one that struck me as the oddest was incentivize economic migrants to leave and disincentivize more from coming by reducing GDP and the range quality of public services. To me, I think, look, you live in Africa or somewhere and they say, hey, you can get a free money by just walking into this country, and it's just a check, and you can spend it on anything. Spend it on drugs, spend it on alcohol, spend it on prostitutes, whatever. I don't see that as a disincentive. I mean, unless we're all living in mud huts, like unless the GDP falls to the level of where they're coming from, then sure, people are going to say, okay, I don't want to go there because, I don't want to be hungry and cold and have no electricity or whatever. But unless you go down to a level where we are extremely inconvenienced by poverty, I don't see how that's going to disincentivize immigration.
There are other countries they could potentially go to as well. I know if you're a European or a white nationalist or whatever, them going to France instead of Germany or vice versa because one has got a basic income which has shrunk the economy, that wouldn't necessarily be a benefit. But I would say this on that issue. Those poor Africans, there are already a multitude of reasons why they would want to migrate to your country. You can go through, just having a job, just even not having a job, even just relying on the streets in America is probably better than being where they are with famine, war, disease, etc. You can go in reasons you can think of why they would want to migrate to your country. UBI wouldn't massively change the game in that regard. But at the same time, I think UBI would harden public attitudes against immigration, soften them towards deportation, reduce native emigration, and incentivize politicians to tighten citizenship requirements. Because we saw this in Finland, where I was reading an article where it was talking about how the UBI was being trialed over there, and it kind of made people more tentative about immigration because they were worried about the country being flooded with people. And this Yeah, so it made people more
So
natural.
yeah, but that doesn't make so you're saying it would actually incentivize economic migrants to come there, and then the influx of migrants would then harden attitudes.
Well, I'm not saying in that order. I'm saying that just having the basic income there would mean people would be like, oh, we can't let huge amounts of people in because they're just going to get they're going to get the 12 grand a year or whatever, and they're
But
going to be.
they already get that in welfare, so like it's the same
I
thing.
don't think they necessarily do get that in welfare. This is overstated. But they would be. I think they if you have a more generous kind of if you have like a big a bag available, just a bag of money there, then people are going to be like, we can't let them in because otherwise they're going to take the money.
Well, I don't understand how you can believe that because there already are all these social welfare programs. We already know that these people consume more than they produce in countries in Europe, in the United States. We already know all the economic facts about it. I could just as easily see it the other way that, well, we've created this population here that is just government dependent, lazy, has a culture of not working. Now we need to import a whole bunch of people from India, Africa, whatever, to do the jobs, and we'll just create a two-tier system. Only citizens get the bread and circuses, and so we need to bring in all these people to do the real work because they're the only ones who have the incentive to do it. I mean, I just see the exact opposite. I don't know how you can believe that.
They're already
Uh,
bringing in enormous numbers of people anyway. I mean, that's
sure, but that doesn't mean that it's going to get better if you increase the amount of socialism and free
it doesn't.
stuff. And
It's just socialism isn't right. Free market policies are far more compatible with mass immigration than socialist policies. Like this is why the Soviet Union, Eastern Bloc nations were
well, they're
far
both
more conservative. They were
no,
far
they're
more.
both compatible. I mean,
Uh,
look,
Socialism is less compatible. If you had mass immigration into a welfare state, it may well lead to the collapse of the welfare state. Whereas in a free market society,
right? So you're saying UBI is good because it would incentivize the people who don't have any skills to sell to move there, and then the state will collapse. It doesn't make any sense.
can
Look,
make that
you're
better.
incentivized to move toward welfare if you don't have any saleable skills or whatever, or if you want to have 7 kids. You're incentivized to move to a free market economy if you have skills and intelligence and you want to work hard and be productive. So like,
Yeah. If you want to let your institutions get taken over by high IQ aliens, then that's a good thing. But we've already seen that what happened in the United States with that policy, haven't we?
well, so, but how is it better? Well, I mean, look, the United States is still a very wealthy and prosperous country with, I mean, it's a great place to live.
Well,
I,
yeah,
I mean,
but
I
it's also a spiritually dead country, a country with
sh-
enormous family breakdown,
sure
enormous.
it's got enormous problems, but so does Poland, and so does pretty much everywhere in the Western
Yeah,
world,
but Poland has
right?
been Americanized to a very large degree. Poland has gone in the
They they
direction.
didn't they didn't have an influx of alien people or whatever, right?
Thank,
They have
thank, but they're still under the NATO umbrella. They're still
they
heavily
have
Americanized.
they've had outmigration of economically productive people.
They have.
They have one of the lowest birth rates. Excuse me. They have one of the lowest birth rates in Europe.
Yeah.
They're maybe not. Maybe you wouldn't consider them spiritually dead, but I don't know what that means. What is
I,
spiritually?
I would consider the Poles to move towards secularism. The fact that they've got such a low birth rate is indicative that Catholicism isn't really the religion of Poland anymore.
Well, Poland has one of the highest rates of religiosity, or they
It's
they
fake.
they they have,
It's
yeah, the two countries in Europe with the highest uh, rates of, well, the greatest number of people who claim to be Christian are Portugal and Poland, both Catholic, by the way. And those two countries have the lowest birth rates in Europe, as far as I know.
um, I don't know if they got the lowest. I think some of the Baltic nations might be low with like 1.1.
Yeah,
I
there might be some small places that have lower. I don't know, but I know that they both have 1.4, lower than, France, Germany, UK, places like that. But of course, you don't
people
know.
talk
Those places, their birth rates are higher because of people coming in. I mean,
people people talk about
you,
how Ireland is such a Catholic conservative country, but they voted for abortion and gay marriage. They're under American hegemony. All of these countries are.
Well, I mean, you can say that everything is controlled by America. I don't know how America controls the birth rates in Poland.
Well,
I think
yeah,
there's a bigger what?
Americanized culture, American culture
Yeah,
essentially
but nobody
has.
forces Poles to watch, translated versions of Friends episodes or whatever. Like, I don't know. This might go back to the difference of opinion about what's happening. Like, I don't think this is all a big conspiracy or something like that. I think it's sort of it's a natural process by which we have moved ourselves out of our natural environment, or the environment to which our emotions are adapted by, inventing technology and creating abundance. Humans are not adapted to abundance. That doesn't mean that the solution to our problems is to crash back to poverty or something like that.
No,
But
but I'm not saying that is necessarily the solution to our problems. But when you're calling it a conspiracy, is it a conspiracy that corporations are going to try and increase their power and influence, muscle out any other alternatives and things like that, promote a kind of lowest common denominator culture, get people addicted to their products and things like this?
but
I don't think
I
that.
don't think that's yeah, I don't think that's a conspiracy. I think people get addicted to products because products are addictive, and companies sell addictive products because they can sell them. I don't
Yeah,
think it's part
yeah.
of some bigger historical conspiracy to destroy Western civilization.
Well, it depends how you see Western civilization. I do think that they do benefit from breaking down the population culturally, ethnically, sexually. I do think there are elite interests that benefit from that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's just a difference in what we think is going on, but
You
I
don't
guess
think that a strong, healthy, unified population would be more of a potential threat to elite interests than a pacified, broken down population?
no, I don't really think that's the case, nor do I think that that's even really like I don't buy these conspiracy theory explanations. I don't think they explain very much. No, I mean, elites might very much want a unified population. They typically try to unify the population around themselves to defend their interests. What's happening is, well, there are a lot of things happening. We've got a globalization of the economy, which means that elites don't necessarily have interests that are tied to one nation. We have a kind of opportunistic attitude among elites because, it's like make a lot of money and then you're set for life and your offspring are set. There are a lot of things going on, but there isn't some grand conspiracy. This isn't all part of some big plan. I don't think that's the
I don't
case.
think they've necessarily sat round a table together, although in the case of, say, Alex Jones, he did get banned simultaneously by all of these companies. But I think that you can analyze all sorts of policies from this angle, and it makes perfect sense. So with the immigration policy, you can divide the public. They're always promoting this racial division in the country. They fill up the country with as many different racial groups as possible, and they play them off against each other. It's divide and conquer.
Well, this hasn't been going on for that long. This divide and conquer SJW pit the races against each other thing really didn't kick off until the like around 2012 or something like that.
I,
Uh,
to, I don't agree with that at all. I think it's been going on for a very long time. I think
there,
if you
there,
look at who actually funded, say, the black groups in the United States, who were
yeah,
chiefly organizing these groups. Um,
there has been a much longer uh, like civil rights agenda or anti-racism agenda and stuff like that. But the modern SJW, well, just let me say something here. The modern SJW pitting the races against each other thing it did not really exist in public as an acceptable position for a long time. That's a fairly new thing. It
but the,
wasn't big in the Bush era. It wasn't big in the Clinton era. It wasn't big in the Reagan era.
they brought affirmative action in back in the 60s. Like this is they've been
No,
militating.
they've had these policies, yes. But if you're talking about the culture and this sort of pitting people against each other thing, it's a fairly new, uh, I don't know,
Uh,
iteration of this leftist ideology.
got more extreme and more out there and more open, but
Right.
it's been going on since the 60s, where the narrative's been white people are oppressing the non-whites and we
Yeah.
have to reduce white power in the culture. This has been the narrative for a very long time among academic media elites.
Right. Yeah. No. Well, there has been a narrative like that. It's not that simple. There were lots of people in the 90s and stuff like that pushing back on that narrative in
Whoa,
public.
but pro-white politics, right? Like, has been verboten for
Sure.
probably since the 1920s or 30s in America. This narrative has been completely marginalized. There has been
Right. But
no.
that doesn't mean that there is some conspiracy and that this serves some interests.
Oh, it does. It definitely does serve elite interests, and I'm sure they are generally
Well,
aware of
okay,
it.
how does it serve elite interests? We can
What
get it.
now?
I don't want to get into this too much because it's going to drag out, but go ahead and explain how that serves elite interests.
For what now?
Well, to basically destroy the countries they live in. How is that going to help them?
Well, to set the groups against each other. Well, if they can set groups against each other, then they're going to be less focused on challenging elite power, aren't they? So if you've got blacks and whites at each other's throats, then the elite is able to push forward with its agenda. And also, if you're able to weaken the more
But what's
intelligent.
the agenda? What's the agenda that they need? They need to create a civil war to push.
Well, they want to increase their wealth, they want to increase their power, and they may have a kind of, some of them may have a sense of
What's the point of that? They're already elites. They already have wealth and power. What's the point of increasing it? If you're talking about individuals competing with each other, sure, but as a group, how would the elites don't need to increase their wealth and power? Elites generally try to hold on to it. They know they can't increase it, and they certainly don't increase it by getting people to fight against each other within their countries.
Well, they can if they can also paralyze majority resistance. So if you've got like a majority population that is, say, more, call it the middle, which is, say, more intelligent, which is potentially unified, which is aware of its own interests, then if the elite abuses them or the elite goes too far in certain respects, the majority can restrain them. It can form a new elite. But if you can weaken the majority, if you can break it down, if you can force it to merge with the underclass to some degree, then the elite can it just doesn't have to worry about it,
Yeah, but instead it has to worry about mass civil unrest and a dysfunctional society. And how is that better? I mean, it doesn't make any sense.
We are insulated from a dysfunctional society. We have to live in a dysfunctional society.
Yeah, but making it dysfunctional does not benefit them in any way. And, if you look at the leftist ideology that gets pushed, it's all anti-corporation, anti-capitalism, anti-rich, and all this stuff. It's very anti-elite. It's of course stupidly anti-elite, but it's still.
If the middle is dysfunctional, that benefits them.
It doesn't.
I disagree. When you say it's anti-elite, though, the left primarily is focused on social justice issues. The elite can manipulate the left very easily. So whenever they start talking about, you saw this with the Occupy Wall Street. They were big into economics, but then they were completely destroyed by this whole social justice thing. They pushed this, and it completely destroys the movement internally.
Well, the Tea Party was sort of right-wing. I don't know how the social justice thing destroyed it, but
Occupy Wall Street, I said.
Well, Occupy Wall Street. Well, Occupy Wall Street. Yeah, I mean, it was just it's like any it's like any online forum eventually gets populated by trolls and misfits. It's the same thing with that, right? All the crazy narcissists went down there and started doing crazy narcissistic things. Obviously, a disorganized protest is going to fail. I don't think that's because of the left. It's just because it's the nature of disorganized.
Hillary Clinton said this, didn't she? She said, Bernie wants to tax the rich, or he wants to regulate the banks or something like that. But how is that going to end racism? How is that going to end sexism? And it's like you can use these social justice issues in order to divert interest away from the economic issues.
Yeah, but I don't know. There really aren't that many big economic. I mean, there are big economic issues in the sense of corruption, but there isn't some massive. Like we don't live in a time when the elites are consuming all the stuff and the ordinary people are living in abject poverty, and you yourself think the average person has too much stuff, right?
Well, I think they consume too much of the wrong stuff, junk food, pornography. I mean, there's a huge amount of things that people consume, gambling, that are bad for them objectively. And I would prefer it if they were, spending more time with their family, their friends, their community, reading, writing, working out, creative activities.
I mean, I think that's all very nice to imagine a world in which people are living like that and all that. But people are not really necessarily going to choose those things, and they're not. The reason why people don't spend time with their families is not really because they can't afford to or because they're working so much. It's because they make different choices. And I think there's a tendency for people in the sort of reactionary sphere or whatever for everybody to just assume that human nature is functional in and of itself, and it sort of works anywhere. And so if there's some problem, it must be due to some outside cause. But we didn't evolve to live in prosperity. We didn't evolve to live with birth control pills. We didn't evolve to live with computers and TV shows and all that stuff. So you're going to expect human nature to sort of break down in this environment. And there's not some simple, human nature is not breaking down because we don't have enough stuff or because we're working too much. The farmer in the Middle Ages, yeah, he might have had some free time during the winter. Maybe he was, home with his family then, but he was also out there working in the fields long hours and during the harvest. Even I don't know if people work more or less now than they did in the past or whatever, but yeah, I just think this is kind of like this mythical golden age of everybody's being together with their families and all that didn't really exist, and people are not being forced to abandon it. They're choosing to abandon it to some extent, not everybody. And the choice is because that's what they want, right? So, in a way, your view is sort of leftist, but it's a little bit confused, or maybe not confused, confusing to me at least. It seems a little bit mixed up. There's, on the one hand, you want to reduce the total amount of stuff that people have so they consume less. On the other hand, you seem to think that people are not doing these things because they have to work so hard to make ends meet. And those two things don't make sense, right? Like, you got to pick one or the other. Either you think people are consuming too much and working too much and you want to reduce consumption and production and labor. But in that case, you can't think that people right now are under some kind of economic hardship that makes them work so much.
Well, I would like to see people, it's like people can consume certain things more than they could in the past. They've got more junk than they used to, but they can't, but it's harder than ever to afford to have a family. That's less economically viable. So it's like,
that's not really true, though. That's a lie. Look,
it is true.
No,
it is
it's
absolutely
not.
true.
People used to have 5-6 kids and live in a farmhouse. They had no electricity and they had to drink out of a well, right?
Well, if you want to go back that far, then yeah. But if you look at house prices, for example, house prices since the 60s I'm not sure which country it is in Britain, I think they've increased something like 11 times.
Yeah, that's a big problem.
Adjusted for inflation. That is a fact. Like, rents also have massively increased. And there are many reasons for this. Education has massively increased in cost. I know in America, healthcare has massively increased in cost.
But basically everything that's subsidized has increased, right? So everything that's government subsidized has had massive inflation because there are no market forces driving it down. They subsidize mortgage payments, they subsidize borrowing money to go to school, and they subsidize healthcare.
Immigration is one factor in why house prices have gone up a lot.
That is a factor, yes. But I totally agree I would say, yeah, if you have a problem with immigration, then that's the policy you want to. I'm anti-immigration.
And also
stop immigration.
Opening the country up to kind of foreign purchase of land as well.
That's another problem. Yeah, I agree. There are lots of problems like that, but they're not caused by by people not having enough money. There's no reason to believe they'd be solved by giving people UBI.
But part of the reason one of the big reasons for my UBI is to break people's dependence on wage slavery, and to break people, and to also reduce the constituency for education as well.
There's no such thing as wage slavery. I mean, you're not a slave.
You absolutely are. No, this is where libertarianism has kind of corrupted your thinking in this
No,
matter.
look, in nature, there is a kind of slavery, which is you're a slave to the laws of physics, which means if you want something,
Yeah,
you have to work
absolutely,
for it.
absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
So like that's all that wage slavery is, a much
No,
kinder
no, no, no,
form
no,
of
no.
it, right?
You're a slave. If you want to survive, essentially, if you want, you have to eat, you have to have a place to sleep, you have to have shelter, warmth, etc. So it's like you've got a gun to your head, forcing you to work in the first place, right?
Right.
So
That's yeah,
in
yeah.
that
So you
sense, you're
have
a slave. You're a slave to your natural functions.
right. So we're always slaves in that sense, no matter what the system is.
Yes, absolutely. Although if you if freedom is a relative, it's never absolute. Like libertarians see freedom as this absolute thing, whereas you have perfect negative freedom. But freedom is on a gradient, and it's positive as well as negative.
Yeah,
So if
I agree
people,
with that. But
good,
I'm saying
good,
that
good.
but what I'm saying is, look, we've always had to work to live. There's no
I
alternative. There is a sort of alternative in that, yes, if you can convince other people to give you a free lunch, you can have a free lunch. But somebody's got to produce the free lunch, right?
Yeah, yeah, of course.
So in aggregate, we're always going to have to work.
Well, unless machines, unless we get to a point where the machines are
Yeah,
essentially doing the work
well,
for us.
maybe we'll get to a point where the owners of the machines, distribute the products of the machines to the masses for some reason, even rather than liquidating the masses.
Yeah,
But
oh yeah, yeah,
we're
yeah. I'm
far
sure.
away from that now, right? And this let me just address this myth of robotics and all that stuff and automation. This is not why people are unemployed in the Western world. Um, there's been this huge amount of outsourcing to places like China for cheap labor. And that's just another reason why the UBI would be bad. You raise the price of labor here, you're encouraging more outsourcing. Go to a country where they don't have the UBI, so people are willing to work more.
Oh well, that's another bullshit libertarian argument because it's like we have to reduce ourselves to slave living standards in order to compete with China.
I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that the reason why there is a lot of unemployment in the West is mainly because of moving production to countries where labor is cheaper. So you could stop that. And I'm not saying we shouldn't stop that. I mean, there are arguments for bringing back a lot of the manufacturing. But my point is it's not robots replacing people in the West. It's Chinese people in China replacing people in the West.
Well, you're claiming this. I'm not an expert on economics, but there have been many economic experts who have claimed that the revolution in automation we're going to see now, with it replacing cognitive jobs as well as physical jobs, is going to lead to an enormous amount of structural and unemployment. So you're going to have all of these taxi drivers, these truck drivers, delivery drivers. A lot of these people are going to be made unemployed. Just a huge amount of jobs, even white collar jobs, are going to go. I'm not saying this is necessarily going to happen.
Yeah,
I don't
it's a
know.
possibility, and it's an interesting one. I mean, like the problem with the Star Trek fantasy was always that they somehow had all these jobs and all these smart people instead of a giant dysgenic, population of misfits being fed by the machines. But so I think it's an interesting question of like in the future, at some point, do we need to replace work as the means of organizing consumption, and what would be the replacement? It's an interesting long-term issue. It's not, however, a real short-term issue. And I just want to
Well,
make that point because people will claim that, well, look, productivity went up, unemployment went up as well. The main reason for that is they took the labor-intensive jobs, moved them overseas. Nobody denies that. When you take labor-intensive jobs, move them overseas, productivity per worker goes up, right?
but
That's a no-brainer.
they are
It has
also
nothing to do with
automating them.
automation. I'm just saying
They
that
are also
automation.
They are doing that domestically though as well. You do go, if you walk into a supermarket, you see there are fewer and fewer workers and more machines there. Like there is domestic automation as well
There is
as
some of it, yeah.
international outsourcing, mass immigration replacing natives. These are all factors.
Right. But I mean, the idea that I'm just saying we do not have massive unemployment because of robots or automation, right? We're bringing in massive numbers of immigrants and we're offshoring a whole bunch of jobs and we have an aging population. I mean, we have more than enough jobs for the people of working age if we stopped immigration and cut back on the outsourcing a little bit. there's no shortage of jobs. So that thing, it could be an interesting long-term theoretical thing to talk about. I think it's interesting. I'm just saying it isn't right now a problem.
Well, I don't know. I don't know exactly what percentage of the jobs have been lost from automation versus outsourcing versus immigration. I'm
Well,
not
but
sure what.
just look at immigration. I mean, like if we were losing so many jobs to automation, then we'd have, and plus with all the immigration flowing into places like the United Kingdom, U.S., Canada, whatever, unemployment would be through the roof, right? But it isn't.
I don't know. Manipulate these unemployment figures. I'm not, they say it's 5%
Um,
but what is it really?
yeah, well, I mean, and I guess also uh, women in the workforce, that's a huge problem, right? Which we agree on. Might disagree with.
Wages, male wages as well. And I would also say about women in the labour forces, UBI would make them, they would be more likely to cut their hours or even drop out of the labour force entirely than men, because they've got a lower propensity to work, partly because they're more likely to take care of children. Also, getting them out of the labour force means there's going to be less adultery as well, because they're surrounded by men, employers with power over them, also male co-workers who they're seeing as much as their husbands. So it would
Well,
probably lead to.
you're always choosing the more. I mean, I guess it's understandable because you're arguing for this thing, but you're always choosing what you're choosing to ignore the other side of the coin here, which is that traditionally what brings men and women together is a dependency relationship. Men need women to reproduce. Women need men to provide for them. And anything that reduces the relevance of labor, like the importance of labor in providing for somebody, like it is going to make men less important to women.
Um, yeah, in theory, but we have moved a long way away from this, right? Like this would have been true more 100 years ago before we had, child support, alimony, women in the workforce as much as or more than men, the welfare system as it is now, affirmative action. Now we've got all these things. Women are more geared towards jobs than families, and this isn't necessarily because they want to be in most cases even, but it's because it's just the economic situation. It's the way it is. You've got to have two earners in order to support a family.
I think
In the
though
1950s, you could have a single earner, and you could have a large family on a single male income, and that's just not economically feasible anymore.
well, yeah, there are a number of reasons for that, which we've already talked about, but it is possible though. I've done it myself, so I know it's possible. But
Well, depending on your income level, yeah, and
well,
depending
but
on
we were very
yeah.
poor for a long time. I mean, it's not like we lived in a very frugally. We had kids and we lived, in cramped quarters and just had a, basic level of life. But it was fine because we wanted to do that. So no, I think a lot of this is personal choice. There's no reason to believe that women are foregoing children because they or for economic reasons.
No, I do think that is part of it.
There might be.
Partly it's time and energy as well. Like if they had UBI, it's kind of like a subsidy for housewives in a way, isn't it? Because right now housewives get nothing. With the UBI, they would get 12 grand a year or whatever. So they'd have more time, energy, and they'd have money. So say you've got a man and a woman, both of them currently earn 25 grand a year. And then the UBI comes in, and then the man gets 37. Maybe the woman then drops out of the labor force. She's still getting 12. So cumulatively, they've got 50, but he's making
Right.
3 times as much as she is.
And
So in
but
relative
again,
and absolute terms, and also if you've got women dropping out of the labor force, male wages are going to increase as well. So in
well, you
absolute
have
and
to take
relative
into
terms.
account the overall drop in production levels that you're envisaging, so that the money that they have is not proportional to the real consumption level, right? Because if you just imagine
Well,
everybody has more money, you can't just imagine everybody has more stuff now.
but
Now they
this is
have
like
less
saying
stuff.
if you got rid of the migrants in the economy, then production would go down and people would get poorer. And no, I mean, migrants
No,
coming
because
in made the natives
consumption would go
poorer.
down too. No, no,
Yeah,
no.
exactly. Well,
You
yeah.
you you specifically believe that this policy would reduce production. So you can't just forget that
To
when you're
some
making these
degree, I don't
arguments.
know how much it would reduce production. I do believe it would somewhat reduce production. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's not like they're going to have. So yeah, when she has the UBI, he has the UBI, he has a salary. They're still going to be consuming less than. So yeah, there will be a subsidy in some sense or a reduced financial incentive for two people to work, but also they will be consuming less on average than, well, everybody's going to be consuming less on average, right?
Yeah.
How it gets
On
shuffled
average,
around.
everybody on
So
average,
yes,
but
you're shuffling more of that to the people who don't work. So they might be consuming more relative to a couple who both work. So the difference between that couple and a couple who both work in this new world might be less than it is now in relative terms. But in absolute terms, you can't say that it would be necessarily more. Well, than the same couple today. It might be.
it may be. I mean,
I mean, it's
we
just like I'm just saying you can't make these assumptions. Now, how do
but
we?
relative, I would say relative is more important than absolute, though. In terms of power, it's more of a relative thing. So if
Well,
men
but
are making, if men say men get a little bit poorer, but
it
they're making
depends on what
several
the
times
incentive.
as much as women, like hypothetically now, that would be a far more powerful incentive for them to get together and stay together than if, you know, income went up in absolute terms, but not in relative terms, you know?
Well, if you're talking about things like family formation, depends. Some things might be absolute, like being able to afford a house or being able to afford an apartment, right? So in that case, if there are now fewer houses being built, or houses are now more expensive because the people who were building them before said, I'm not going to do this job, or I'm not going to do it unless you pay me a lot more money than I was getting before, whatever that might be. So you can't, I don't know. I'm not going to claim that I can work all this out in my head on the fly, but you can't assume that everything's going to stay the same, right? That's my
No,
fundamental point.
no,
The
of
economy is
course.
going to totally change, so you can't just say, well, now these people are going to have more money if the woman stays home. Well, they're going to have more money, I guess, maybe. I don't know. But will they have more consumption power? That's another question.
Yeah,
Um,
there's also going to be less need for the family to own a second vehicle as well. And cars, everything to do with cars is enormous cost. If you've only got one earner, you don't need that second car anymore. So that's going to save money. Also, you don't have to send your children off to that very expensive childcare, daycare. So that's going to save money. Also, there are going to be more
sure,
home cooked
sure, but these
meals,
things are
more
these things
home
are all
cooked,
true now. These things are all true now.
more home cooked meals rather than going out. Well, if you
The
have to have two earners right
right.
now in order to make ends meet, but with
But
the
you
UBI
don't. But you
one,
don't have to have two earners to make ends meet. You can still make these choices. You can still move to a rural area. You can still, have a single earner household. You're just assuming, and this was one of my like high level criticisms. You're just assuming that, well, if this happened, everything would work out the way I want it to. But you can't make that claim unless you can. I mean, there's really no way to know for sure. But you can't
well,
just
there
assume
is.
that,
The
right?
policy could be implemented, and then we can see how behavior changes.
Well, yeah, you could try it and see if everything collapses and the country burns down. Oops, oh, I guess it was a mistake, right? Same thing with communism. It sounds great when you can just sort of,
Well,
imagine that something would work
I
out.
would bet that a country that, if Switzerland or a country like that adopted UBI, I would bet it wouldn't burn down. And I don't think you would bet it would burn down. You would think things would change to a small degree, maybe it'll be less efficient or whatever, but it's not going to burn the country down.
Yeah, well, I don't know if it's going to burn it down. I don't know, it might. I mean, it might not burn it down, but it might have the same effect that, communism has on countries, like create a very um, dysfunctional society. That's
But
what
when
I
you
would.
talk about communism being so bad, I don't think communism per se, state socialism, is worse than what we have now. Maybe that's just a political difference between us. And I'm not a leftist even, but I do know that communist societies were far more nationalistic and far more socially conservative, probably less dysgenic than the current societies we have now.
Well, maybe. I don't know. Some of them had very low fertility. Some of them had high fertility when this, like in Romania, when the state kind of imposed it in some ways. And they had enormous numbers of adopted children that were put up for adoption, and these state-run, like a lot of psychopathic killers. I don't know how many. There were a bunch of Romanian orphans that were adopted, and I've heard stories about them because they were like abandoned as children in these orphanages and stuff, and then they turned into kind of psychopathic, or just they acted up in lots of horrible ways, and there are stories about that. But
well, there was a lot of child molestation, institutional pedophilia in West.
Sure. I'm not using that as an argument.
In capitalist West Germany. I mean,
yeah. I'm not using that as an argument. I'm just saying that the different things happen in communist countries. Some of them were pretty bad.
Oh, but Eastern Europe was under communism. Eastern Europe was more pronatal than it is relatively more liberal today. No question about it.
Well, every place was more pronatal in the past, but I don't know that it was actually that pronatal. I know that fertility dropped very rapidly in both Russia and China. China had a very rapid fertility drop in the 1950s before the one-child policy.
They were trying to reduce their birth rate, weren't they?
No, before the one-child policy even. So communism had a very rapid effect on fertility, and communism generally put women into the workforce, and it promoted equality in that sense.
It did, yeah.
And so anyway, China had that big fertility drop. Russia had a big fertility drop, but fertility is not a good, in my opinion. It's just fertility. High fertility eventually causes collapse. It leads to population explosions. You need to limit fertility to have stability, and that's one of the problems. So my view of the problems with modern civilization is not that people don't have the means to have children or that the fertility is too low or whatever. It's that we have not replaced the regulatory feedback loops that existed before. And those regulatory feedback loops were basically children dying before the age of 12, right? So if you want to have a long-term condition of children not dying before the age of 12, you need to regulate reproduction. That's my bottom line. And all of these other things, like I believe in free market economics because it works. So having a high level of production is something I think is desirable when you take other things into consideration.
When has free market economics ever been tried? Where is this pure libertarian economics?
No, I'm not saying well, there's no such thing. I don't know what pure libertarianism would be.
Free market, though. I don't think there's. I mean, free market is just a theoretical construct.
Well, it's a term. I mean, what it means. I have an article on that on socialism and capitalism if you're interested. But to me, I would say that free market is the government sets out rules for property and transactions, but allows the economy to structure itself in an emergent way through market transactions. So in other words, it allows prices to determine economic activity. And socialism is where the state organizes production and consumption. So you can have, and we have a mixture of those things. We have the state.
I was just going to say, so where is this free market society then? Because I don't think there are any.
What, you don't think the market functions anywhere? You don't think that any place has a market?
No. I don't think there are any free market societies. I think every society.
What do you mean by free market? I don't know what you're.
By your definition,
what was my definition? What was my definition?
You were saying that no, every society has a market by your definition, but they also have socialism as well. Every society.
Sure. Right.
Yeah.
So what's your point? I mean, that's what I was just saying. Yeah, every society has socialism, and within it has, well, I would say every society has a market because some very simple ones don't. But yeah, we use the market. So my point is the market as a mechanism for organizing economic activity is efficient. And so it's the reason why we have such powerful economies. We can produce so many things.
I wouldn't say so. Well, the market is not sufficient in itself. You've got to have a precondition. So having a high IQ, homogeneous population helps as well, but a high IQ population. You could have free market policies in Africa and you get shit. If you have a homogeneous socialist population, that will do a lot better, even in economic terms, than a free market African population.
Well, a homogeneous African population? Under
homogeneous.
communism?
A free market African population will do more poorly economically than a socialistic European population.
Well, that may be true, but that's not really relevant. I don't know what's that supposed to prove?
Well, because
I didn't say the market was
itself
magic.
isn't sufficient.
I said
and
it's
also,
a mechanism for organizing economic activity, and
it is. But,
it's a good mechanism. It works.
But is it good? Does it really work though? Well, is it a good thing to have a free market in pornography? Is it a good thing to have a free market in drugs? Is it a good thing to have a free market in gambling?
Yeah, but the thing is, if you're going to debate these things, the issue there is not does the market work as an organization mechanism. Now you're getting into questions of how human nature meshes with modernity, right? So if you're talking about pornography, you're saying, well, maybe giving people more freedom isn't good, or they will misuse the freedom because they don't have the means of making these choices themselves. Okay, so you could certainly make that argument, right? That what the market does, it doesn't choose where we as a society should go. It doesn't say whether pornography is good or bad. It simply optimizes the production of the things that people want. Now, you can certainly critique what people want, and I do that. I have something called Alienation and Art where I talk about that. It's like two articles above the one you commented on. So there are lots of issues, but that's not really an economic issue. That's more of a psychological question, right? Moving production of pornography out of the market and giving it to the government, is that going to solve it? No.
Oh, no. I think it should just be stamped out. No, I think.
Well, but that's not a question of economic organization. That's a question of whether you think it's good for people.
Yeah. But
so you could have a market where you say pornography is illegal and you leave it up to the market to produce things. But because that's illegal, it can't be produced, right? Just like you can't produce plutonium and sell it. I'm sure there are people who'd like to buy it, right?
Although, I mean, we don't need to get into a huge debate on economics, but certainly the market, in a recession, for example, or in a depression, leaving a free market there. I mean, there are good Keynesian arguments why there should be stimulus spending. There are also natural monopolies that the free market really can't take care of. There are also people who the market. I mean,
but I'm not a market fundamentalist here. I mean, but my point is, like, there's this tendency of some people to just try to make everything into an economic problem when it's not. Like, this is not the problems you're concerned with don't strike me as economic problems, and I don't think they have economic solutions. Well, like most of the problems you bring up, you think, well, I think it would help with this, and I think it would help with that. Well, maybe it would make it worse, but it's not really engaging the problem where the problem lies. The problems with, like, the problem we have with modernity is not that there's too much not that we have too much free market economics, or not that people can't afford the basic necessities of life, which is what UBI is all about, right? That's not the problem. The problem is or one of the problems is that people are choosing things that you think they shouldn't be choosing. They're maladapted to the environment. That's not because they don't get a check every month. It's because our brains are not adapted to abundance and modern technology and all these other things.
From the position of minoritarian political movements, though, be it having to be in the education system or having to be in the employment market, and the nature of the capitalist system these days is that it's people are dispersed geographically. People don't live within one community anymore. They don't. It's like you don't grow up with the same people. Your friends for life. You work in the kind of similar job that your father did, so on. That doesn't happen. People are spread out all over the country and they communicate via the internet. But these relationships are very shallow. They're not deep, rich, meaningful, real life relationships. So if you could have something like UBI, you can deatomize people. You could bring people from all over the country to definite points. They could have fraternities, communes. They're drawn away from maybe their parents, from their employers, and they can form those tight-knit enclaves, pool resources, and share costs.
This just sounds like utopian dreaming in which you
It's
ignore
not. This is what people
that
would.
most people are going to have to do work to produce the things that those people, these communitarians or whatever, are going to be consuming.
Yeah, and these people can also work as well. It's not like
And
you can't work with UBI. Like
well, I don't know. I think we're kind of going
these
back
people
over.
could. They have a basis then in order to form their little community, pool their resources, share the costs. It's very, very efficient to
And
do that.
they could do that now. They could do that
Well,
now.
no, they can't because they don't have the resources to do it now.
Sure they
They
can.
don't
The
have the
Amish
freedom
do
to do
it.
it now.
The Amish can do it. Anybody could do it if they really wanted to. You get 5, 6 people together, you could do it.
It's very, very difficult. If you give people UBI,
Yeah.
you give them the freedom to leave their jobs, to leave education, just leave it all behind, go to a completely different area. It's much easier to do it with UBI. You'd see
Okay.
an
Well,
enormous amount of it.
all right. Well, anyway, I don't want to debate it forever, and we're coming up on 2 hours, so I guess we can end it there.
Sure.
Anyway, it was good talking to you. So
Likewise.
do you want me to link to something if I post this? Do you have a
Just my Twitter, I guess.
Okay, just post that in there in Skype.
Yep, sure, no problem. Well, it's been good to talk to you anyway. I found it enjoyable, engaging, you know.
Yeah, it was a good discussion. I mean, yeah. All right. I'll talk to you later.
Bye for now.